Cooking from scratch, especially gluten-free, seems daunting and a lot of work. I was there and I thought there's no way, because gluten-free cooking, it's never going to turn out right when you don't have the gluten. Wrong. I have worked for the last 6 years to cook all of our meals completely from scratch, gluten-free, and they are actually delicious. I actually serve them to people that don't have to eat gluten-free, and they say how delicious they are. But there are some tricks behind it all, and I am going to share with you my 10 tips for cooking from scratch, gluten-free, getting started, and having your products turn out right. Tip number one for you, and probably the most important tip, is get yourself a good gluten-free all-purpose flour blend. Now, I have a couple that I recommend from the store that you can buy, Cup for Cup, Better Batter. Even Bob's Red Mill has really stepped up their all-purpose flour. When I was a kid, it wasn't that great. It was really grainy. Now they've really stepped it up, and I actually would recommend it this time around. Or you can do what I've done, and I got tired of spending the costly amount of buying those blends and buying additional flour to make my bread products with. And so I created my own blend that's the most like Cup for Cup, and I share that in my digital cookbook, which I'll link in the description. And that is what I use for almost everything besides breads. Having a good gluten-free flour blend is a make or break when you're making a product, because here's a little secret. You don't need just a gluten-free recipe. You can take any recipe, and if you have the right tools on your shelf, you can convert it to gluten-free and it'll taste delicious. But having the right gluten-free flour is important, because they're not all the same. There are blends out there that, the reason it's called a blend is because it's a mix of a gluten-free grain, gluten-free starches, and a binding agent. And if you don't mix the right ones together, you might have a more grainy texture, you might have a more grainy taste. Some grains, or gluten-free grains, are really, really powerful tasting, like buckwheat and millet. But then you have grains like brown rice and white rice that aren't as powerful of a taste. And so finding that right blend of those flours is going to be super important in how your end product is going to taste. So I will link Cup for Cup, Better Batter, Bob's Red Meal, and I will link my digital cookbook where I share my homemade blend. But getting yourself, tip number one, getting the right all-purpose flour on your shelves to have all the time is highly important to cooking from scratch gluten-free. Tip number two, get a good amount of cornstarch. Always have cornstarch in your cabinet, because if you just need to thicken a gravy, if you just need to thicken a cheese sauce, any of that, yes, you can use an all-purpose flour, and that works fine too, but save yourself some money. You don't need to spend your costly dollars on a flour blend to thicken something. You can thicken it with cornstarch, and it's going to taste just the same. Just for a little tip, Thanksgiving, if I'm not hosting, if I'm not cooking, I ask to make the gravy, because I'll make the gravy, all of it, with cornstarch. Nobody can tell the difference, and it's safe for everybody to eat, my girls and I included. And so always having cornstarch on your shelf is tip number two. Make sure that you always have it so that you can use it in place of any kind of thickening that you need to do when you're baking. And I promise you, nobody's going to be able to tell. Now here's a tip that'll save you a lot of frustration. And I wish I would have figured this out sooner. And that is, no matter what you're making, if you're trying to form a dough, so if you're trying to form a roll-out cookie dough, if you're trying to form a bread dough, if you're trying, whatever it is that you're trying to create, donuts, use less liquid than the recipe calls for, even if the recipe is a gluten-free recipe. And the reason for this is because a lot of times when you're building these things, when you're making these, you are using a variety, or all the time, you're using a variety of flours. It's very rare that you're just going to use one flour. And for whatever reason, gluten-free doesn't absorb the liquid like a regular flour. And so it always always seems like I need less liquid than what any recipe calls for. If it doesn't, what the cool thing is it's so easy to splash in water or milk or whatever it is that you're making a little bit at a time until you get the right consistency than it is to add flours back in. Because if you're using multiple flours, which flour do you add back in? No matter what you do, you're not going to get the right ratio of flour again. And so it's easier to do the liquid. So I always, if a recipe calls for 2 cups of water, I always do maybe 1.5 cups. And then I add splashes until I get the right consistency. And I would say more, 9 times out of 10, if not 10 out of 10, I never need the full amount of liquid. So that is a big tip to save you a lot of frustration. If you're trying to make biscuits, if you're trying to do any of that gluten-free, use less liquid to start with, and then add in the liquid as you need to get the right consistency. It'll save you so much frustration and not having this very sticky, watery dough that you can't do anything with, because gluten-free is hard to work with in itself. Let's make it a little bit easier. Use less liquid. Okay, remember how I said get yourself a good all-purpose flour blend? Yes, do that. But tip number, what are we on? Tip number 4, get yourself a good flour blend. However, when you're making bread products, don't use your flour blend. I have tried so many gluten-free recipes out there for a bread product that calls for an all-purpose flour blend, and they never ever turn out right. They don't taste right. They don't have the right texture. They get really gummy. And that is because most flour blends are made up of a lot of starches and a little bit of grains. And you need to have a good ratio of grain to starch. You actually want a little bit less starch and a little bit more grain when you're doing bread. You also need to have the right amount of binding agent, because gluten-free grains and gluten-free flour does not have a binding agent in it. You have to add that. Well, when you make an all-purpose flour blend, you do add a binding agent to it, but it's not going to be the right amount that you need that's dispersed through the whole flour blend that you need in a bread. So you need to be able to build your own flour in a bread recipe and add the appropriate amount of binding agent for that specific amount of flour and for that specific bread. So again, just like in the previous tip with liquid, you're going to want to use a little bit less liquid for breads, but using an all-purpose flour blend in a gluten-free bread typically does not work. I have never had success with it in the 6 years I've been baking bread. I've never had success with using an all-purpose flour blend in my bread recipes. So if you find one on Pinterest, if you find one online that calls for an all-purpose flour blend, the likelihood of it turning out in texture and taste is probably not very good. Now, what I'm finding is it may taste okay, but the texture won't be right. And I'm not looking for a really gummy, dense texture. I want a light, fluffy texture in bread. And it is possible, but not with an all-purpose flour blend. Okay, tip number 5. I'm over here in kind of my bulk food section. And tip number 5 is buy in bulk as much as you can. So when I talk about making my own flour blend, when I talk about building my own bread flours to make bread dough, all of that is possible because I buy in bulk. Having cornstarch on your shelf, I buy in bulk. Everything, as much as I can, that is a dry ingredient, I buy in bulk. I stick them in these big 5-gallon buckets here with a Gamma Seal lid, and that is the best way to have the ingredients that you need when you're cooking from scratch gluten-free. So there's nothing more frustrating than wanting to make a loaf of bread and you only bought a little bag, 3-pound bag of flour, and you are all out and you don't have anything else and you can't make the bread. There's nothing frustrating. So tip number 5, if you can, buy in bulk as much as you can. I buy all of my gluten-free flours on Azure Standard, which I will link in the description. And that has been the biggest blessing in being able to get a good quality gluten-free flour and a wide variety of gluten-free flour. If you can't find the flour that you're looking for on Azure Standard, you can go ahead and go to Amazon, but there's so many options and you don't know if you're getting a good quality or not. Azure, I know I'm getting a good quality, and they have all gluten-free flour. They have all kinds of different ranges of grains and stuff. So take a look, see which ones work for you. Tip number 6, get some cream of anything soup powder mix and get it onto your shelf. This is a game changer when you're using it for a quick busy night and you need a cream of something soup and you need it for a casserole or something that night. This is a perfect solution to have it when you need it. So no cream of anything soups are gluten-free. Plus, they're not really that good for you. The ones from the store, they have a lot of additives to it. Very simple to make some of this, and you won't even be able to tell. It has some dry milk powder in it, has some cornstarch in it, and a bunch of spices. You can add chopped up mushrooms if you're doing a cream of mushroom. You can do, if you're doing cream of chicken, just do chicken broth. Honestly, I just do either chicken broth or beef broth and the powder, and it tastes just fine. I don't add anything to it. Now you can if you want to, but get this powder mixed up. I'll link it in the description, but it is so easy to have and ready to go when you're cooking from scratch gluten-free and you know you're gonna need a cream of something soup that is gluten-free. Tip number 7, you do not need strictly gluten-free cookbooks. I think I might have just, I'm looking at my cookbooks down there, I think I have one that is an actual gluten-free cookbook. You can use any cookbook that you want, and any recipe can be adapted to be gluten-free. And that's the beauty of cooking from scratch. Is I take recipes all the time and I look at it. And a lot of times there's just one ingredient that needs to be changed in order for it to be gluten-free. And then you have a gluten-free meal that the whole family can enjoy, and they don't really even know because it was just that one little ingredient. Besides breads, my husband is not gluten-free, but besides breads, he eats everything gluten-free, and he would never know. And he does know because we're gluten-free, but he wouldn't if I just served it to him. I serve one dish to everybody. If I'm making scalloped potatoes, I use an all-purpose flour, and all that you just have to change the flour to thicken, or use cornstarch to thicken the cheese sauce to make scalloped potatoes. And then the whole dish is gluten-free. Nobody can tell the difference. So don't just look for gluten-free cookbooks. They can be helpful and good, and there are good ones out there, but you don't have to just stay in that little box. You can use all of your cookbooks. Don't throw them out. You can use them all. Just know what you need to change, and then you can just take your favorite recipes and change that simple ingredient to be able to make it gluten-free. Okay, let's talk about binding agents. This is, I think it's tip number 8. So gluten-free flours do not have binding agents in them. You need to add them, and there are 3 kinds you can add. You can do gur gum, which I hardly ever do, but I do have some in case I want to use it. You can do xanthan gum, which I do have that, and I buy those at Walmart, so you can get those really anywhere. And then I buy psyllium husk, and I do use psyllium husk. Psyllium husk is probably my favorite. I use xanthan gum and psyllium husk the most. Psyllium husk is my favorite in bread products. And but let me give you a little tip on the psyllium husk. Not all brands of psyllium husk are the same. I learned that the hard way. If your bread is dense and gray, it's likely the psyllium husk brand that you're using. The 2 that I have found that are the best psyllium husk powder is the Now brand, which I don't have this in a nice cute little container, but I do buy it on Amazon, and I buy bags of these at a time. And then the other brand is the Anthony's brand. For some reason, I've been having a hard time finding the Anthony's brand, so I've been just using the Now brand, and I like it just the same. It binds my dough together perfectly. Your dough will not ever bind if you don't have a binding agent. So these 3 are very important. You need to pick one of them in your products. In my all-purpose flour blend, I use xanthan gum. So it just depends on what I'm making to determine which binding agent I use. But the big thing is to know the brands of your psyllium husk powder and to get the right one so that you have a good product with it. Okay, tip number 9. So we are going to talk about this time, and I'm not going to talk about it too much because I go over it really extensively in our whole grain course that my friend Andrea and I did at Dearmark 23. And I'll link the course in the description. This is just talking about whole grains regular and whole grains gluten-free and how to build the flour and all of that. I talk a lot more extensively in the course on that, but I will touch on this. All gluten-free flour blends need to have a grain flour, and they need to have a starch along with a binding agent. And so there are multiple different grains that you can use. You can use millet, you can use brown rice, white rice, you can use oats, you can use sorghum, you can use, did I say millet? I did. Buckwheat. There's multiple different grains. There's heavier grains, there's lighter grains. It's up to you on which one that your family likes. But it also needs to be paired with some form of a starch, and that's tapioca starch, cornstarch, arrowroot powder. I tend to use tapioca starch or tapioca flour. They're the same thing, so don't get confused in the packaging. I tend to use that the most whenever I'm building a flour. So if I'm building it with a grain and then I'm adding my starch, I typically use tapioca starch. The flavor isn't very strong. and I can get it widely, and it's easy. I get it actually in 25-pound bags on Azure Standard. Now when you're building it, you can do multiple grains. You don't just need to stick with one grain. If you want to keep it simple, you can stick with one grain, but those are the 3 things that you need to have. You need to have a grain flour, you need to have a starch, and you need to have a binding agent, and put them all together to make any kind of a flour. So when you're cooking from scratch, gluten-free, and you're trying to convert a recipe, the easiest way to do that, depending on what it is, if it's not a bread product, say it's a pancake thing, an all-purpose flour will be just fine to do that in. But if you're using a bread and you need to build a flour and it's calling for an all-purpose flour, you're going to want to do a 2-to-1 ratio. So I will do 2 cups of a grain flour to 1 cup of a starch. So that would be how you would build it together to be able to get what they're calling for. Now, I have had the most success in my breads, and you'll notice if you watch any of my bread videos, everything is weighed. And that's a different video for another day. Go back and watch any bread videos that you need to on making gluten-free bread. But weighing your flours when making bread is what's going to not give you a dense product. So doing the 2-to-1 ratio is okay, but it's not going to be the best option all the time. Okay, my tip number 10 is know the sides that are naturally gluten-free. So potatoes, rice, and beans are naturally gluten-free. So when you're looking for a side to put together with your dish, turn to those. I always have bulk rice. Always. I get it on Azure Standard. I always have a lot of potatoes. We go through a lot of potatoes. I get those at Costco. I've also gotten them on Azure Standard for years, but now since I've been doing Costco once a month as well as Azure, I just get them at Costco. They're a little bit cheaper. I always have cans of beans that I home canned on my shelf. Always, because those things are naturally gluten-free. You can quickly throw those together and you'll have a side to go with any protein meat that you have, and it's delicious. And so just know what is naturally gluten-free and always have those in stock. Always have those ready to go so you can do a quick gluten-free side anytime. And it doesn't have to be complicated. It can be just diced up tomatoes with some seasoning and olive oil popped in the oven. We call those roasted potatoes, and they're delicious. It can be a baked potato. It can be, I do have a rice-a-roni recipe that's really simple and easy to make. Everybody loves, and it's way better than the rice-a-roni that you can get from the store in the box. And those aren't gluten-free anyway. So this is a gluten-free version or regular version, either way you want to make it. It's super easy to throw these sides together when you know which items are naturally gluten-free. You don't have to make any adjustments. You just know what you need and you go ahead and do it. So I hope that this video was helpful. I hope it gave you some encouragement. If you're just starting out with gluten-free and you want to start cooking from scratch, but it seems daunting, it seems overwhelming, and it seems like it would never work, it will work. I promise you it will. I hope these tips will help you to get started in your journey of cooking from scratch gluten-free, because they are tips that I've learned over the years as I've gone. Make sure to like and subscribe to the video. I send out one new video every single week. Jump on over to the blog and join our email community over there. I send an email a week over there as well with recipes and farm life. I do canning recipes, as you can hear my canner in the background. And all of those recipes are shared over there as well. I hope this video was helpful, and we'll see you next time. Take care.